Welcome to A True Life Story. There I was, standing in front of my bedroom mirror, fumbling with the thin straps of my summer dress. The late afternoon sun spilled through the blinds, painting golden streaks across the room. But my mind, it was somewhere else entirely. Dinner was ready. I just finished setting the table, waiting for him to come in from the garden. He'd been out there, fixing the broken trellis, something he took on without me even asking. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder, my fingers clumsily wrestling with the clasp. Normally, my hands are steady, sure, but not this time. Just as I thought I'd managed it, the clasp gave out. The strap slipped, the dress followed, and I stood there, momentarily frozen. The fabric gathered at my waist, leaving me bathed in nothing but lace and the soft, golden glow of the sun. And then, I heard it, a knock. "Dinner smells amazing. Do you need?" I spun around, clutching the dress to my chest. There in the doorway was my stepson, Jason. His gaze lingered, just for a moment too long, before he quickly turned his head. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, his voice tight and rushed, like the air had been knocked out of him. "It's fine." I cut him off, my voice steady, though my cheeks burned with heat I couldn't hide. "The door must have been slightly open, that's all." He nodded, backing away, his eyes darting to meet mine for the briefest second before he disappeared down the hall. And I just stood there, gripping the fabric of my dress, staring at the now empty doorway. My heart pounded, hard, fast, in a way that felt both strange and familiar. I'm 52, a widow for almost 5 years now. This big, sprawling house, it's mine. It's quiet, too quiet. My late husband, Jason, left me everything: security, comfort, a life most would envy. But he also left me with something I didn't expect, a hollow, aching emptiness. It echoes in every room, every quiet moment, every routine task. And then there's Ben, Jason's son from his first marriage. He's 27 now. Tall, confident, but in this quiet, unassuming way that's both infuriating and endearing. When Jason passed, Ben made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "Family doesn't just stop," he said at the funeral, his hand warm on mine, his grief mirroring my own. Over the years, Ben has been my anchor in ways I never saw coming. He's the one who shows up to fix the things Jason would have handled: mending fences, clearing gutters, hauling heavy boxes up from the basement. We fell into a rhythm. Easy. Comfortable. His presence eased the loneliness I worked so hard to hide. But lately, something shifted. It's in the way his eyes linger just a beat too long when I hand him a glass of iced tea. The way he stands a little too close when we're flipping through old family photo albums. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, a trick of grief and a lonely heart. But after today, after that moment in the doorway, his voice catching, his cheeks flushing, I'm not so sure anymore. That night at dinner, the tension between us was palpable. He sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up, his tan forearms casually resting on the edge of the table. He complimented the roast chicken I'd made, his words easy, light. I nodded, smiling, but my mind was far from the conversation. All I could think about was earlier, the way his eyes had widened before he turned away. Like he'd seen something he shouldn't. Like he wanted to look longer but knew he couldn't. The thing is, I wasn't as angry as I thought I'd be. Or as embarrassed. Shouldn't I have been? I should have felt outraged, humiliated. Instead, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite put into words. Sometimes, we don't notice the lines we're crossing until it's too late. After dinner, I should have felt something more appropriate. Maybe indignation, embarrassment, anything that made sense for a woman in my position. But instead, there was this warmth, a strange, unwelcome heat that coiled in my chest and spread to places I hadn't thought about in years. I tried to shake it off, sipping my wine, but every time I glanced up, I caught him looking at me. His eyes darted back to his plate the moment our gazes met, but the shift was undeniable. It wasn't just me noticing him, it was him noticing me. Later, he offered to do the dishes. I sat in the living room pretending to read, but my attention drifted. I watched him instead, The sound of water running and plates clinking created a kind of rhythm that lulled me into a daze. His broad shoulders moved under his t-shirt as he leaned over the sink. And in that moment, I forgot myself. I forgot the years, the boundaries, the fact that I had helped raise him. None of it mattered. All I saw was him. When he turned off the faucet and glanced at me, his lips parting slightly, my heart skipped a beat. And I knew this was just the beginning. The next morning felt like a test I wasn't prepared for. I was in the kitchen, pouring coffee into my favorite mug, when the back door creaked open. "Morning," Ben called out, his voice low and raspy, like he was still shaking off sleep. I turned, catching sight of him in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt clung to his chest, and a toolbox dangled from one hand. "Morning," I replied, forcing my voice to stay calm, even as my pulse quickened. "Figured I'd get started on the back fence before it gets too hot," he said, stepping inside. The faint scent of earth and pine followed him, filling the room. "Coffee?" I asked, holding up the pot. He gave me that lopsided grin, the one that always left me off balance. "Sure, black, please." When I handed him the mug, our fingers brushed. It was the briefest touch, barely a second, but it sent a ripple through me like a static charge. I glanced up. His eyes met mine. It was fleeting, just a moment, but it lingered, heavy in the air between us. The rest of the day passed in fragments of moments like that. Later, I stood on the porch, watching him work on the fence. He was focused, hammering nails with an easy precision. His broad shoulders flexed with every movement, and the streak of sweat glistening at his temple caught the light. I scolded myself for looking, for letting my thoughts wander to places they shouldn't. But it was impossible not to notice him, the quiet confidence he carried, the way he moved. At one point, he glanced over his shoulder and caught me staring. Flustered, I turned away quickly, pretending to adjust the hem of my sundress. My heart pounded so loud, I was sure he could hear it. When he finished, I brought out a pitcher of lemonade. He was sitting on the porch steps, his hair damp and clinging to his skin. I joined him, handing him a glass. "Looks like you fixed it," I said, nodding toward the fence. "Only because I had a good excuse to come over," he replied, his tone playful, but his eyes searching mine. I laughed softly, brushing it off, but his words stuck with me. The weight of them lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying every detail, the brush of his fingers, the way his eyes lingered, the tension that had hung between us all day. This wasn't just in my head anymore. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. Sometimes you tell yourself it's harmless, a passing thought, but deep down, it's something more. I couldn't stop thinking about that day. His voice, his smile, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. It all felt too vivid, too real to ignore. I tried convincing myself it was nothing. Harmless, just in my head, but deep down, I knew better. A few days later, he showed up again. "I thought I'd take a look at the deck," he said, standing in the doorway with that familiar toolbox in hand. The deck didn't need fixing. I knew it, and I was pretty sure he did too. But I didn't question it. I just stepped aside and let him in. As he worked, I brought out a tray of iced tea. The summer heat was relentless, and the cold drink was a small mercy. "Thanks," he said, taking a long sip before leaning against the railing. His gaze shifted toward me, lingering in a way I couldn't ignore. He began, his voice soft. "I think this is the first summer I've really spent time here with you." I smiled, warmth blooming in my chest. "I'm glad you're here, Ben. I really am." His eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. Over the following weeks, his visits became more frequent. He always found reasons to be around. Fixing a squeaky door hinge, replacing a light bulb, trimming the hedges. Little things. Excuses, really. But with every visit, our conversations grew deeper, more personal. He told me stories about his childhood, how he used to resent his father for remarrying so quickly after his mother left. Then he paused, looking at me with an almost shy smile. "But," he said, "it didn't take long for me to realize how lucky he was. To have found you. His words caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. Then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and suddenly, everything else faded away. One evening, we found ourselves on the porch swing, a bottle of wine between us. At first, the conversation was light, memories of Jason, stories about Ben's college days. But as the wine flowed, so did the words we'd both been holding back. "I never told you this," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but after Dad passed, I didn't just come around to help you. I came because I needed to be here. With you." His confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Ben, I started, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "I know it's wrong," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I know how it looks, but I can't ignore what I feel." The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. He stopped by to drop off a new garden hose, but before he could leave, the sky opened up. The rain came down in sheets, battering against the windows and leaving us stranded inside. We ended up on the couch, a movie playing softly in the background. I couldn't tell you what it was. Neither of us was paying attention. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence. "About what?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "About us." My heart skipped a beat. "Ben, we can't," I started, but he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "We're not hurting anyone. It's just us here, in this moment. Why can't we have that?" His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to argue, to push him away. But the truth, I couldn't. Because deep down, I wanted it too. Before I could say anything, he leaned in. His hand cupped my face, and his lips brushed against mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss deepened, and for that moment, the world fell away. There was no rain, no judgment, no past or future, just us. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I couldn't stop myself. I shook my head, my hands trembling as they rested against his. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. We sat there for what felt like hours, the rain hammering against the windows, its relentless rhythm filling the room. Neither of us said a word, but the quiet wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged with an understanding neither of us dared to voice. By the time the rain stopped, something had shifted. A line had been crossed. There was no going back. The next evening, Ben showed up again. Unannounced. It caught me off guard. It wasn't like him. I hadn't even begun to process what had happened between us. And now, here he was, standing at my door, a determined look in his eyes that made my pulse race. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice steady, but edged with raw emotion. I hesitated, gripping the doorframe. "Ben, maybe we should talk about..." He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "We've been avoiding this," he said, "for weeks, for months. And I think we both know where this is going." I wanted to argue, to tell him this was wrong. But his words hung in the air, undeniable, and brimming with a truth I couldn't escape. "Let me in," he said softly. It wasn't a demand, it was a plea. And before I could think it through, I stepped aside, letting him in, not just into the house, but into a part of me I'd been guarding for years. We ended up in the living room. The space that once felt so vast and empty now felt impossibly small, the air thick with tension neither of us tried to name. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I know this isn't easy for you," he began, his voice low, "but I can't keep pretending that what I feel isn't real. And I don't think you can either, Ben." I whispered, but the words caught in my throat. He stood, slowly, closing the space between us again. His hand reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, it left me breathless. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice barely audible. Before I could stop myself, I leaned into his touch. And just like that, the dam broke. His lips met mine. And this time, There was no hesitation. The kiss was deliberate, slow, full of everything we'd been holding back. His hands rested lightly on my hips, not demanding, just holding me there, as if afraid I'd slip away. When we pulled apart, my breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing with every reason why this was a mistake. But then I looked into his eyes, soft, earnest, and full of emotions I hadn't felt in years. "I don't want to stop," he said, his voice steady. And neither did I. We moved to the couch, the world outside fading into the background. The hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards became the only sounds around us. He kissed me again, deeper this time, his hand trailing up my arm, igniting a warmth that spread through me like wildfire. "This is crazy," I whispered, my forehead resting against his. "Maybe," he replied, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate patterns on my back. "But it feels right." And it did, too right. His hand slipped to my waist, pulling me closer. My breath hitched, my body betraying the caution my mind was desperately clinging to. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice strained, his eyes searching mine. But I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his, a silent answer, a surrender. What followed was a blur of whispered reassurances, soft touches, and stolen moments in the dim light of the room. Every kiss, every caress felt like a piece of a puzzle we'd been waiting to solve. When it was over, we lay on the couch, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp. His arm draped loosely around my waist as I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. I looked up at him, my heart aching with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Neither do I admitted, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying. But as the quiet settled around us, reality began to creep back in. What we had done couldn't be undone. And while it had felt right in the moment, I couldn't ignore the questions swirling in my mind, questions that wouldn't let me sleep that night. What happens now? I asked the question softly, my voice barely a whisper. Jason didn't hesitate. His arm tightened around me, his thumb tracing slow, lazy circles on my hip. "We figure it out. Together," he said. There was a quiet confidence in his words, and for a moment, it steadied me. But I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Lines had been crossed, boundaries blurred, and we couldn't pretend otherwise. Still, beneath all the fear and uncertainty, there was something undeniable. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The morning light crept in through the thick curtains, casting golden streaks across the living room floor. I sat at the edge of the couch, still wrapped in the blanket Jason had pulled over me during the night. The house was silent now, save for the faint chirping of birds outside. But my mind, anything but quiet. "I don't regret this," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Jason had left before sunrise. He'd pressed a lingering kiss to my forehead, whispering that we'd talk soon. I watched him walk out the door, his figure dissolving into the soft haze of dawn, and with him, the fleeting euphoria of the night before began to fade. Now, in the clear light of day, reality hit like a cold wind. I held a mug of coffee in my hands, the steam long gone, my fingers absently tracing its curve. My thoughts swung wildly between the tenderness of his touch and the heavy weight of what we'd done. I had crossed a line I had spent years trying to define and respect, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I'd been seen, truly seen. Jason didn't look at me as someone he had to care for or pity. He saw me as a woman, one with fears, desires, and longings that had been buried under years of grief and routine. But one question loomed, casting a shadow over everything. Its answer felt as elusive as sleep had been the night before. What now? The whispers of doubt and judgment gnawed at the edges of my mind. I thought of the life Ben and I had built together, the memories woven into the walls of this house. What would he think of me now? And Jason, what would this mean for him? For us? I placed the mug on the table, my hands trembling. The path forward wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. A week passed before I saw Jason again. I spent those days trying to distract myself, gardening, reorganizing the attic, even repainting the guest bedroom. Anything to keep my mind from replaying that night. But no amount of busy-work could erase the memory of his touch, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way his voice softened when he said my name. When he finally showed up on the porch that Saturday morning, my heart both leaped and sank. He looked different, calmer, more measured, but there was a tension in his shoulders that betrayed the weight of whatever he'd come to say. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he admitted, standing there with his hands stuffed into his pockets. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, before stepping aside and gesturing for him to come in. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice even as my emotions swirled like a storm inside me. "Of course I want to see you," I said. Jason stepped inside, and for a moment, we just stood there. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like everything we needed to say hung there, unspoken, waiting for one of us to break the stillness. Finally, he did. "I've thought about that night," he said, his voice careful but unwavering. "About us. Every single day since it happened." I didn't respond, couldn't respond, as his words hung in the air. "I know it's complicated," he continued. "I know this isn't what anyone would expect, but I can't ignore how I feel about you. And honestly, I don't want to." His honesty hit me like a wave. I'd spent so much time trapped in my own head, second-guessing everything, imagining every possible consequence. I never let myself consider what it might feel like to let go, to embrace this, to embrace him. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "So am I," he replied, stepping closer. "But I'd rather be scared with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." His words struck something deep inside me. They lingered, pulling at the part of me that had been locked away for years. And in that moment, something shifted. Later, as I walked him to the door, his hand lingered on the doorknob. He turned to face me, his expression soft but resolute. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "Come with you?" I asked, startled. "Where?" "Anywhere," he said simply, his eyes locking with mine. "Leave all of this behind. Start fresh. Together." I froze, my mind spinning with questions, doubts, and a million reasons why this was impossible. But when I looked at him, standing there with hope in his eyes and quiet determination in his voice, I felt something stir inside me. It wasn't certainty, not yet, but it was something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. "I'll think about it," I said at last, a small, uncertain smile tugging at my lips. Jason smiled back, and as he walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if this asterisk was the start of something new, something I hadn't even dared to dream of.